Pick up a rock. Not a special one. Just a rock, the kind you'd kick off a sidewalk without thinking twice. Now imagine your entire species depends on what you do with it next. That was the situation, over and over, for millions of years before anyone wrote a word, built a wall, or planted a seed. Long before agriculture. Long before fire was tamed. Long before anything you'd recognize as civilization. There was a hand, a stone, and a decision. And one of those decisions changed everything. We like to imagine the first tool as something dramatic. A spear. A club. Some caveman moment out of a movie, roaring at the sky. The reality is smaller, quieter, and honestly a little embarrassing. The first tool that mattered wasn't a weapon at all. It was a sharp edge, knocked off a stone by striking it against another stone at a very specific angle. That's it. That's the invention. But here's the thing. That tiny, unglamorous action is arguably the single most consequential thing a living creature has ever done on this planet. Not because of what it cut. Because of what it started. For a long time, the story was clean. Simple, even. Around 2.5 million years ago, a creature in our family tree, not quite human, not quite ape, began deliberately fracturing stones to create sharp flakes. Archaeologists call this the Oldowan toolkit, named after Oldoway Gorge in Tanzania, where the pattern was first identified. The story went, bigger brain, better tools, in that order. Brain first. Tools second. Intelligence as the cause, technology as the result? That sounds obvious. Except it does not fully work. In 2015, a team led by archaeologist Sonia Harman was digging near Lake Turkana in Kenya, at a site called Lomekwi 3. What they found broke the timeline. Stone tools, deliberately shaped, dated to roughly 3.3 million years old. That's about 700,000 years before the earliest known member of our own genus, Homo, even existed. The toolmakers weren't us. They weren't even close to us. Let that sit for a moment. Something without a human brain, without human hands as we'd define them, was already striking stone with enough control and consistency to produce sharp, usable edges. The old assumption, big brain first, clever hands second, quietly collapsed. Tool use didn't wait for intelligence to arrive. It may have helped drag intelligence into existence. Now zoom out, because this is where it gets stranger. Making a sharp stone flake sounds easy. Grab 2 rocks, smash them together, hope for the best. Try it sometime, or better yet, don't, because you'll probably just bruise your hand and produce a pile of useless gravel. In 2013, archaeologist Nicholas Toth ran experimental studies having modern humans attempt to replicate Oldowan-style toolmaking from scratch. The results were humbling. It took real practice, real trial and error, to consistently produce a usable cutting edge instead of a chunk of shattered rock. You need to select the right stone. You need to strike at the correct angle, with the correct force, in the correct spot. Miss by a few degrees and you get nothing. This wasn't random smashing. It was a skill. That's not primitive. That's engineering, with zero instructions and zero margin for error. And once that skill existed, everything downstream of it started to shift. A sharp stone flake does something a hand, a tooth, or a claw cannot do efficiently. It opens things. Hide. Muscle. Bone. Suddenly, a creature that couldn't outbite a lion or outrun a hyena could still get to the meat and marrow those predators left behind. That's not a small advantage. That's a new way of surviving entirely. The strongest evidence for this comes from a site called Kagera South, in Kenya. In 2010, researcher David Braun and his team analyzed animal bones from the site, dated to roughly 2 million years old, and found cut marks and deliberate fracture patterns consistent with sustained, repeated butchery, not a single desperate meal, but an ongoing pattern of behavior. This wasn't an accident of survival. It was a strategy. Meat and marrow are dense in calories and fat feeds one organ more than any other, the brain. Here's where it gets interesting. You've probably heard that using tools made ancient humans smarter. That's true, but it undersells what actually happened. It wasn't just that tools required intelligence. It's that tools funded intelligence. More access to fat and protein meant more energy available for a metabolically expensive organ that was, at the time, doing something no other species on Earth was doing quite the same way, expanding, generation after generation, largely because it finally had the fuel to do it. Bring that back to you for a second. Every time you've ever opened a package, sliced a vegetable, or used scissors, You're using a direct descendant of that first violent little collision between two rocks. Your entire relationship with the physical world, cutting it, shaping it, bending it to what you need, traces back to a creature that didn't even have language yet. But we should be honest about what we don't actually know. Here's the skeptical case, and it deserves real weight. We don't have direct footage of the Lomekwi toolmakers using their tools. We don't have proof of intent in the way we'd like. No diary entries saying, "Today I invented technology." Maybe some of these early flakes were incidental. Maybe an animal stepped on a rock, or a rock cracked naturally against another during a fall, and only some of what archaeologists are finding is truly deliberate. The line between "sharp rock that happened" and "sharp rock that was made" is not always obvious in the fossil record, especially at sites this old and this fragmentary. Some researchers have raised exactly this concern about early stone assemblages, that natural fracture processes can mimic intentional flaking, and that without clear, repeated, pattern strikes, you can't always rule out coincidence. That's a fair challenge. It should make you cautious. But the Lomekwi evidence doesn't rest on one lucky rock. It rests on a whole cluster of them, showing the same repeated striking pattern, the same selection of stone type, the same consistent angle of force, spread across multiple pieces at the same site. Nature doesn't usually repeat a specific, controlled fracture pattern over and over by accident. A single suspicious rock is coincidence. Dozens of rocks striking the exact same pattern is a technique. So the uncertainty doesn't disappear. But it narrows. It gets stranger the more species you look at. Chimpanzees crack nuts with stones. Some populations of Capuchin monkeys in Brazil use stone hammers on cashews, leaving behind broken flakes that, out of context, can resemble early human tools. Sea otters use rocks to smash open shellfish. Tool use, in its crudest form, is not uniquely human. What made the Lomekwi toolmakers different wasn't the idea of using a rock. It was the deliberate reshaping of the rock itself, creating something that didn't exist in nature until a mind decided it should. That is the actual threshold. Not using an object, modifying one on purpose to solve a problem that hadn't been solved yet. And once that threshold was crossed, it never really closed again. Every structure you live in, every device in your pocket, every scalpel, every plow, every rocket, sits downstream of a decision made by a creature without a real language, without a real plan, without any concept of what it was starting. It didn't know it was inventing history. It was almost certainly just hungry. That's the part that should sit uneasily with you. We tend to imagine our defining moment as some grand leap, a spark of genius, a triumphant realization. The honest answer is Messier. It was closer to trial, error, hunger, and a few million lucky strikes that eventually stopped being lucky and started being learned. The unsettling part is how ordinary the beginning actually was. No ceremony. No witness. Just pressure, stone, and repetition, somewhere in East Africa, long before anyone was around to call it a beginning at all. We still don't know exactly who struck that first deliberate flake, or whether they understood, even a little, what they were doing. That gap will probably never close completely. The evidence is too old, too fragmentary, too easily erased by time. But the next time you pick something up without thinking, a knife, a key, a pair of scissors, remember what you're actually holding. Not a tool. A continuation. Somewhere, a very long time ago, something without our brain, without our language, without any idea what it was setting in motion, picked up a rock. And it hasn't put it down since.